Okay, greetings everyone. Welcome to our low-tech presentation of Module 1, which is about strategic linkages in the climate change evidence base. And this is the first module of our 7-part series. And these were designed actually to be self-guided presentations that you can use on the internet. But for if for whatever reason you're not able to utilize the online platform, you can simply listen to these lectures, and we'll step through these presentations and we'll step through them slide by slide. So again, this is Module 1, Strategic Linkages in Climate Change Evidence Base, for preparing your simplified approval process concept note for the Green Climate Fund. Now, the primary purpose, as you can see here, the primary purpose of this module is to guide you through the process of selecting an appropriate project topic for your concept note. The GCF has specific rules on the types of projects that it will support, and the simplified approval process, as a specialized window of the GCF, has certain guidelines that you have to follow. So the key task is to identify the right problem for a SAP project. And for us, this really involves two key tasks, both of which we'll cover in this module. So these tasks are, the first one is to connecting your concept note to existing strategies and policies. And we'll go over this in part 1 of this module. In part 2, we'll look at developing the climate evidence base for your concept note. And remember that these are supported, each of these parts of the module are supported by exercises and worksheets that we've developed as well. But both of these steps are critical. Concept notes and full project proposals are often rejected or sent back for revision by the GCF because they overlook these two key steps. So these are common errors. These are errors that are made by project proponents in many cases. And we'll try to help you avoid some errors as we go through this module. But first we have a lesson, and this is our lesson from practice. Now, we often say that we can like to learn from best practices. We like to learn from things that have worked, but we can also learn from worst practices or things that have not worked. We can learn from the mistakes that people have made in the past. So one of the most common kinds of errors for GCF projects anyway is poor project selection. Now, for the GCF and other climate financiers, we don't need to pick project ideas out of the sky or fish them out of the sea. And that's because of financiers like the GCF, well, they only support project ideas that have already been identified as part of a national climate change strategy of some sort. Financiers from the GCF on down to the JEF Small Grants Program will tell you that one of the most common mistakes that organizations submit project proposals that are not connected to existing policies and strategies. No matter how brilliant and innovative your idea is, if it is not connected to policies and strategies, then the idea will generally be rejected in most cases. So let's not go fishing for project ideas, but rather let's look at existing policies and strategies for project ideas. And that's a good place to start. So we don't have to look too far to find the topic for our project. We don't have to make up the topic. The topic must be aligned with your national priorities. So let's look at a graphic here. Now, in this diagram, the diagram shows the process of problem formulation. And we like to think of problem formulation as being among the most important steps in developing a concept note, identifying a problem. And we're going to spend a lot of time in this course up front at the problem formulation stage before we even decide what our project is going to do. So we're not going to jump in and design the project right away. We're not going to start deciding how to spend the money or what activities to do or anything like that. But rather, we're going to spend some time on identifying the right problem. And by doing this, by spending some time up front, it will save us a significant amount of time down the road. So on this slide here, you can see a simplified diagram of problem formulation. And what we have here is, you can see, and I'll use my pointer here, we've got step 1. And these are strategic linkages. That's really the first thing that I want to do when I'm developing a GCF concept note or a project is I like to review my country's National Adaptation Plan, the NAP, or the NAPA, the National Adaptation Program of Action, if I'm working in a least developed country, or any kind of climate change action plan or joint climate change disaster risk reduction plan or policy, any of those strategies. First, before I start to decide what kind of project I want to do, I'm going to review and familiarize myself with all of those documents, because those documents generally have priorities already identified. So somebody has already done the hard work of identifying the priority adaptation areas and the priority mitigation areas for you, right? So for example, your country may have decided that for mitigation, we're going to prioritize energy efficiency. That's the priority direction for the country. And so that would mean that any GCF project you do should align with that overall priority of increasing energy efficiency. Or in the case of adaptation, your country may have identified climate smart or climate resilient agriculture, strengthening the resilience of the agriculture sector as a priority. And if that's the case, well, it would be a good idea to design a project that increases the resilience of the agriculture sector. So again, we're going to look at the NAP and the National Adaptation Plan. NDC, that's the nationally determined contribution, as you probably know. NCs, these are national communications to the UNFCCC. We're going to look at these national priorities and for climate change. But then after looking at the climate change priorities, we'll look at the sectoral strategies too, because most climate change adaptation and mitigation projects have a home in a sector. So the example that I just provided, increasing energy efficiency, well, that's probably going to be executed or implemented by, at least in part, by our Ministry of Energy. Or a climate smart agriculture project, well, the Department of Agriculture will have a significant role in that. So what I'd like to do is review those sectoral strategies, the Department of Agriculture or the Ministry of Energy's sectoral strategy, their 5-year plan or their strategic plan, and also align the project with the strategies in those sectors. So that's number 1, and that's what we'll be covering in the first part of this module, and that's what our first exercise is about as well. So we've got a guide that will help you do this for your own concept note. And then our second step here is building an evidence base. And as you can see over here on the side, this is what we're doing in part 2 of this module today. We're building an evidence base, and the evidence base is a climate change linkages. It's linking our project, our problem, to climate change processes. And I won't talk too much about that here because we will focus on that in the second part of this module. We also have a demonstration video and a tool that focuses specifically on building the evidence base. And so there's a lot of information that we're providing about that. And then we move on to our step 3, identifying the non-climate factors that shape the problem. And we'll do this in module 2. We'll do this in our next module. Not today's module, but the next module. And the non-climate factors that shape the problem, well, these are the things, the factors, the socioeconomic or cultural or political or geographic factors that tend to make people, places, and things more vulnerable to climate change impacts, right? These are things that make your problem worse. Now, on to the next slide. So our part one, again, we're focusing on policy linkages. Part one is connecting your concept note to existing strategies. So as we mentioned earlier, our first task is to make sure that our concept note is aligned with our country's existing priorities. Now this is one way that your concept note demonstrates country ownership. And more concretely, it will help you to answer one of the specific questions on the concept note template, as you can see in the slide here. This is B1 of the concept note template, and as you can see in part of B1, section B1 is to please indicate how the project fits with the country's national priorities, action plans, and programs, and its full ownership of the concept. So you can see that we have ownership mentioned a couple of times. It's mentioned here in the question itself, and we also have it in bold in our description. So country ownership is important, and we'll talk about it more over the course of this class, of the course, the different modules. But it's one of the 5 investment criteria that the GCF uses to evaluate concept notes and full proposals. So these investment criteria are fully discussed in Module 6, but it helps to consider them throughout the entire process of your concept note, especially when you're deciding on a project topic. So you can use the investment criteria to help you choose a topic for your project. And that's really important because the criteria are the criteria tell you the types of things that the GCF wants to invest in, the types of projects that they want to fund. So therefore, it makes sense that you would use the criteria to select the topic for your project. So the GCF SAP funding proposal preparation guidelines, the manual, explains that country ownership is demonstrated by alignment and contribution to national climate change strategies like the NDCs, or Nationally Determined Contributions, or NAPs, National Adaptation Plans, National Adaptation Programs of Action, and nationally appropriate mitigation actions, and other relevant policies like economic strategies, development policies and plans, disaster risk reduction policies, etc., as well as the regional or international commitments that can be related to the outcome of the project, like the Sendai framework, for example. So those are the things that the GCF SAP funding proposal preparation guideline says is important. Remember, national climate change strategies like your NAP, your NAPA, NDC, nationally appropriate mitigation actions, and other relevant policies like your country's national economic development strategy, and like that. So on the next slide here, we've got a screenshot, a low resolution screenshot from the Simplified Approval Process Funding Proposal guidelines, which I mentioned in the previous slide. And you can download this. You can download it just by Google GCF SAP Funding Proposal Guidelines. But we have the URL here too. But you can also click on this or use your smartphone to take a picture of this QR code, and I'll move my arrow out of the way. Take a picture of the QR code, and that will take you to the site where you can download this these funding proposal preparation guidelines. Now remember that these guidelines are for funding proposals, which is the advanced stage. We're working on the concept note right now. So we're not doing a full funding proposal yet. Remember that you have to have your concept note approved by the GCF before you move on to the full funding proposal. But there are some guidelines in here. There are some helpful hints. It tells you all about the investment criteria and some other things that you'll need to know. So it's a good idea to read through this the funding proposal guidelines. Now let's move on. So aligning your concept note with existing strategies. So like we said earlier, to demonstrate that our concept note is aligned with existing strategies, we have to connect it to plans and policies that have already been published and ratified in your country. This includes, now what I like to do when I'm designing a concept note is I think about this in terms of a hierarchy. There are certain plans that I will look at first. And that on number 1 here, you can see those plans. This is linkages to national and subnational climate change policies. Yeah, and these will really help me to decide what topic I want to do my project on. So the linkages to the national and subnational climate change policies is very important because the GCF has a mandate to help countries, to support countries in implementing both their NAPs, their National Adaptation Plans, and their NDCs, their Nationally Determined Contributions. So linking your concept note to these national and subnational climate change policies is very important. So we say subnational climate change policies and strategies. Some countries don't have those, but there's a tendency in countries with a federal system, for example, India or the Federated States of Micronesia, where they have a significant degree of decentralization. There's often subnational climate change policies. If your country does not have that, you don't have to worry about it. But once I've narrowed down my topic, using the national and subnational climate change policies. So, for example, I know that I want to do a climate smart agriculture project or an agricultural resilience project because that's in my NAP. Then I'm going to start to look for linkages to the National Development Strategy and frameworks. So our National Economic Development Plan, the guiding document for economic development in the country. That's what I'll look at. And usually these have pillars, action areas, and so forth. Most of us are familiar with linkages with the National Development Strategy. And then we're going to look at the sectoral strategies and frameworks. Agriculture sector, the rural development sector, coastal resources sector, the marine resources sector, whichever sector is most relevant to your project topic, well, you want to look at those sectoral strategies as well. And then we'll look at linkages to cross-cutting frameworks. And when we say cross-cutting frameworks, this is things like disaster risk reduction strategies, plans, and policies, gender equality and gender equity plans. That's extremely important. So we're going to in our SAP concept note, we're definitely going to mainstream gender considerations from the very beginning of our design process. And one way we can do that is by linking the idea to the country's gender action framework if it exists. And then we'll link to international frameworks. And so these are things like the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and so forth, the Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll look at each of these in slides. But remember, please always remember, we've got our tip down at the bottom, as you can see. Projects don't exist in isolation. So remember that your project doesn't exist in isolation. You can think of it as part of a broader approach to improve lives and livelihoods in your country and your community. Now, this broader approach includes enabling policies put in place by the government, initiatives undertaken by non-government organizations, faith-based organizations, and other civil society stakeholders, as well as grassroots community-level actions in the private sector. Yeah. So remember that no single project or program is going to fully address climate change, adaptation, or mitigation in your country. It's just too big of a problem, too big of an issue. There's not a single adaptation project that's going to work, but rather you need a coordinated approach, and your project is part of that coordinated approach. So in this way, as you can see in my picture here, your project is a piece of a bigger puzzle. So your project should complement all of the other elements, and it should be connected to them. So with this step, when we align your concept note with existing strategies, you should describe how your project connects to the other pieces of the puzzle. So that's what we're really doing here. So let's take a closer look at linkages to national and subnational climate change policies. So by now, as you can see, most countries have put in place a framework to guide climate change adaptation and mitigation at the national level. This could be your NDC, this could be your NAPA, your National Adaptation Plan. Therefore, your first step is to identify a project topic that is part of this framework. So you can review these documents that we have listed here, like the NAP, the National Adaptation Plan. And if you want to find your NAP, you should have access to it, but you can go to NAP Central at the UNFCCC. Just Google your country's name and NAP, and you'll find it that way on the internet if your country has produced a NAP. A lot of countries are currently in the process of developing NAPs. And then we've got your NDC, your Nationally Determined Contribution, and you can find that in a similar way. Your GCF country program. Now, some countries have formulated engagement plans with the GCF, so that's important to make sure that you are looking into that. Ask your NDA, your National Designated Authority, or just Google your country and see if we've got a country program. And if you do, you need to reference a country program pretty carefully and closely. You could also reference your National Adaptation Program of Action, or your NAPA, and your National Communications to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So some countries have more of these, some countries have fewer, but I've seen countries with one national communication, and I've seen countries with as many as 6. So it's a good idea to reference the most recent one. They often have vulnerability and risk assessments associated with them, and they have a lot of good information about priority vulnerabilities and priority adaptation and mitigation measures. And then you can also reference other climate change strategies, like if your country has a joint national plan for climate change and disaster risk reduction, or something like that. So you select a select a priority impact and project area that's described in these documents. So remember that your SAP has to be a soft project. That means that it has to be because it's a simplified approval process, it has to have little, if any, environmental footprint. So project designers use the term soft project to refer to projects that involve things like capacity development or institutional strengthening or strengthening the regulatory framework, private sector engagement, curriculum design, extension services, and so forth. On the other hand, we've got hard projects, and you can't do a hard project with a SAP, but hard projects are those that involve construction of buildings and things like that. Right? Most infrastructure projects are hard projects. So just in summary, remember that the GCF is part of the overall United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change system, and therefore it follows guidance from the UNFCCC. And based on this guidance, the GCF has a mandate to support projects that come from countries' national adaptation plans and also their nationally determined contributions. So let's move on, and we'll look at linkages to national development strategies. So as you no doubt know, all countries have national development strategies and plans. And really, in most places, it's the job of the line agencies, the sectoral ministries, to advance the national development strategy. The national development strategy is the glue that holds all things together. So in most cases, these strategies include priority pillars and strategic goals and programs. And just to give you an idea, we have an illustration from Vanuatu's Vision 2030. That's their national development strategy. And many countries have a Vision 2020 or a Vision 2030. That's their strategic development plan. But in the case of Vanuatu, we've got 3 pillars. And those pillars are divided into different programs. You can see Society Program 1, Vibrant Cultural Identity, and that would probably have a number of indicators associated with it or priority actions. And we want to make sure that our project idea is aligning with those things. So what we'll do is we will review the appropriate national strategies and identify how our strategy helps to advance these relevant policies, in the national strategy. So in some cases, this may be addressed in the national climate change strategies already. So for example, your National Adaptation Plan, your NAP, it may describe how the NAP is aligned with the National Development Strategy. But in case it doesn't, make sure that you are reviewing the National Development Strategy yourself. So for example, if you review your country's climate change policies, if your review of policies has led you to address impacts on agriculture, and if your country's national development plan has a focus on improving food security, well, there's a key connection there that can be made in your concept note. Make sure that you point those things out. This concept note, the project that is described in this concept note, will advance both the National Development Plan priorities for agriculture and the agriculture sector priorities for agriculture. Okay, now on to point 3. Remember, this is linkages to relevant sectoral strategies and frameworks. So next, you can identify the priorities in the sectoral strategies and plans. As you know, most line ministries or line agencies have strategic plans, and then they'll have medium-term plans, and maybe 1 or 2 year work plans or plans of action. So in every country has a hierarchy of planning processes, and they differ slightly from place to place, but there's often some similarities. There may be a long-term plan and a medium-term plan and short-term actions that are taken. So what we want to do is understand what the priorities are in the long term and medium term. What are the things that the line agency is doing? Which direction is it going? So like the National Development Strategy, these plans and strategies at the sectoral level, they're likely to include key pillars. And this will help to show the GCF, if we reference these things, it will help to show the GCF that your project will advance existing priorities that have already been identified. And if you can do that, if your project can reinforce the priorities that have already been identified by your Ministry of Agriculture or your Ministry of Infrastructure or your Ministry of Education, your Ministry of Health, then it increases the likelihood that those agencies, those ministries, are going to have buy-in, right? So it increases the ownership over the project. So make sure you include all relevant sectoral strategies. So if you're planning to help farmers with climate-smart agriculture practices, well, certainly there's an agriculture ministry, and they have an agriculture sector strategy. But in many countries, there's a Ministry of Rural Development or something like that. There may be a small business agency for developing entrepreneurial skills and things like that, and value chains. So reference all of the things that are relevant to your particular project. Now, our fourth element is to link to cross-cutting frameworks. So your concept note, it should reference these cross-cutting issues whenever it can. When there are plans and strategies, make sure that you reference those, that you're aware of those. And the GCF pays very close attention to this. So for example, gender. In all cases, your concept note should reference your country's efforts to improve gender equity and equality. That's very important for the GCF. And we'll talk more about that in a later module. But as we're identifying the policy linkages, that's one of the first things that we need to do. But also disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management plans. So there are a lot of overlaps between climate change and disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management. And so reviewing and referencing the relevant policies will show the GCF that your project is synergistic and not redundant. So it's working to advance those policies and priorities that have already been identified. Food security, sometimes there's a food security policy. Sometimes there's a green growth strategy or a green growth plan. Peace building roadmaps, especially in post-conflict situations, you may find those. So reference all of these things as appropriate. And then lastly, we'll look at linkages to international frameworks. So be sure to describe how your project addresses the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and any other relevant international agreements. So we'll talk more about the Sustainable Development Goals in Module 6. It's very important to reference the Sustainable Development Goals and the development co-benefits that your project will bring. That helps to illustrate the sustainable development potential of your project, which is another of GCF's investment criteria. So you can also reference regional agreements as well. For example, ASEAN, the Association of the Southeast Asian nations, or other regional frameworks. So next, let's look at an example. Now we're going to use an example of a made-up country, a fake country, a fictional country throughout the whole module series. So we'll come back to Keithtopia. Keithtopia is the name of our fictional country, and I've named Keithtopia after myself because my name is Keith. So we're in Keithtopia. We want to develop a climate change project, a SAP project. So the first thing that we need to do, we'll follow these 5 steps. We'll review climate change policies. We'll review national development strategies, sectoral policies. We'll review cost-cutting frameworks and so forth. And so in step 1, right, the country of Keithtopia has several climate change related plans and frameworks. So our team reviewed them all. First, we looked at the Keithtopia National Adaptation Program of Action in NAPA, because Keithtopia it's a small island developing state, but it's also an LDC. So first we looked at the NAPA, and we also looked at the Nationally Determined Contribution, NDC, and the Second National Communication to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or SNC. So we were able to access all of these, fortunately, online. We found these online. So from these documents, we learned that Keithtopia's agriculture sector has been affected already by climate change, and these effects will continue and get worse in the future. So we also reached out to the Ministry of Climate Change in Keithtopia, the Ministry of Climate Change and Space Exploration, to request a copy of the National Adaptation Plan. But the National Adaptation Plan, it hasn't been approved yet. It's in the advanced draft stage. So it's gone to the Keithtopia Royal Advisory Council for review and approval, and they're reviewing the document. But we got a draft. They let us to review the draft, and the draft also includes a major focus on the agriculture sector. And it specifically references concerns about changing rainfall patterns, which would adversely affect both rain-fed and irrigated agriculture in the country. So we also decided that we would need to incorporate the NAP into our concept note, because the NAP will be approved soon. So by the time our concept note gets reviewed by GCF, the NAP will probably be in effect. It will be approved. So we need to have that in our concept note. So based on these documents, we decided to focus on the agriculture sector, on the agriculture priority from the NAP. Now, step 2, we reviewed Keithtopia's Vision 2040 Strategic Development Plan. And it turns out that improving agriculture and food security is the second priority pillar of Vision 2040. Education is education for all. Improving education for all is the first pillar. But the second pillar is improving agriculture and food security. We also took note of key targets for this pillar, and this includes ensuring that the agriculture sector is able to expand productivity in a sustainable way, and it involves expanding the resilience of small-scale farmers against all manner of shocks and stressors. So that's in the National Development Plan, and the Vision 2040. Step 3, after we reviewed the Strategic Development Plan, we looked at plans from the relevant sectors. And this is agriculture and water resources. This is 2 different ministries, 2 different line ministries. The Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Water Resources Management in Keithtopia. And they each have strategies. So we learned that the agriculture sector policy is closely aligned with the Vision 2040 plan, as you might expect. That the sectoral policies are generally lined up with this national strategic economic vision. We also learned that the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fishery has plans to increase the area under cultivation for some crops by investing in irrigation infrastructure and by encouraging small-scale farmers to shift from subsistence cassava to a mixture of crops for household use and higher value crops for the market. So they're in the midst of promoting an agricultural transformation from subsistence crops like cassava into higher value crops. That's the strategy that the Ministry of Agriculture is pursuing, and that's very important for our concept note development. So we also, according to the Water Resources Management Plan, we learned that Keitopia is looking to move towards utilizing integrated water resources management, which many of us are familiar with, IWRM. And also they're seeking to improve management of groundwater resources, or aquifers. So those are the key directions of the line ministries that are associated with our project. Now, step 4, we also reviewed the Keitopia Comprehensive Action Plan for Gender Equity and Equality. And we learned that the government wants to address some gender inequalities that persist in rural areas. And the government has established participation guidelines for all activities in rural areas, especially capacity development activities. And these new guidelines, they say that at least 40% of participants in all activities should be women. The government is also planning to establish a new microfinance scheme and an entrepreneurship training program for women in rural communities. So these are very important things that might be useful in the design of our concept note if we can connect to these broader initiatives to improve gender equality and gender equity in Keitopia. Now, we looked at Keitopia's roadmap to disaster resilience. That's the DRR plan, the Disaster Risk Reduction Plan for the country. And it prioritizes helping rural households in adapting to droughts. Lastly, we reviewed Keitopia's Sustainable Development Goals and Green Growth Framework. So we have a strategy in Keitopia for the Sustainable Development Goals and Green Growth. And we determined that improving water availability and climate-smart agriculture in a gender equitable manner, well, that would contribute to the achievement of the national targets for SDGs 2, 5, 10, 13, and 15. So based on all of this, we created an outline of how the different policies, strategies, and frameworks link to the general topic. And we've selected for our project increasing the resilience of the increasing the climate resilience of the agriculture sector. So this outline helped us to formulate a summary for our concept note, which is shown on the next slide. So let's look at our outline here. We took all of that information, and look here in B1, it says, please indicate how the project fits with the country's national priorities, action plans, programs, and its full ownership of the concept. And at this point, at our first submission, we don't have very many words. We have to be very succinct about this. So we just have 500 words, and this is just part of the question. So we took all of that previous information and we developed a very short description of how the project aligns with all of those strategies, right? But we did the research first, and so it was easy to do this. So we can see the government of Keitopia is concerned about threats to agriculture productivity and food security. At present, 60% of the population is engaged in some level of subsistence agriculture. A key priority in the Keitopia Vision 2040 long-term strategic development plan is to improve food security and increase agricultural productivity. So the agriculture sector policy of Keitopia is closely aligned with the Vision 2040 plan, and that the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries for Keitopia has plans to increase the area under cultivation for cash crops by investing in irrigation infrastructure and by encouraging small-scale farmers to shift from subsistence production to cassava, of cassava, to mixed production for market and household subsistence. A recent pilot project had focused on improving climate resilience of small-scale farmers by promoting climate-smart agriculture teachings in rural villages, right? So that explains how our agriculture project, remember, it's an agriculture project that we're doing. And this explains how the agriculture project links to the existing strategies and priorities that have already been identified. So next, we've got a tool and an exercise for strategic linkages. So the module contains a tool. You can find this by exiting out of this presentation and going back to the home page for Module 1. And you'll find a tool and a guide to help you review strategies, policies, plans, and frameworks. And it contains step-by-step guidance to help you do this process. So you can use the tool to extract the key linkages to support your concept note. So the tool and the exercise will help you to address the corresponding questions in section B1 of the concept note template, as you see here. So that's our first section. That's our first section out of the way, our strategic linkages. So let's take a quiz very quickly to test our knowledge here. Now, number 1, your SAP concept note should link to all of the following except A, national and subnational climate change policies, B, neighboring country policy frameworks, C, national development strategies and frameworks, or D, sectoral strategies and frameworks. So it should link to all of these except there's one that doesn't belong in here. And which one is it? Well, I think it's B. Neighboring country policy frameworks. There's no reason that our project needs to link to these. So is that our answer? Yes, indeed. That's the one that doesn't belong. All of the other ones that we want to link to national and subnational climate change policies, yes, definitely. We definitely want to link to national development strategies and frameworks, and we most certainly want to link to sectoral strategies and frameworks. Now next, which of the following documents should be considered when selecting a topic for a climate change project? The NAP, the National Adaptation Plan, the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution, or the National Communications, the NCs, to the UNFCCC, or all of the above. Let's have a look again. Which of the following documents? Now remember, we should reference all of the documents that are related to climate change, because they articulate the policies, right? And they articulate the priorities that have already been identified. We don't make up new priorities for our project, so we reference the priorities that we already have. So the answer here is going to be all of the above. All of these are the correct answer. Now let's move on to the last one. A climate change problem let's choose the best answer here. We're looking for the best answer. The best answer. So a climate change problem is a problem that can exist in the absence of climate change. That doesn't really make sense. It doesn't make sense that a climate change problem exists in the absence of climate change. It's probably not A. And then what? Is a climate change problem is B? Is it a problem that is sometimes difficult to differentiate between a development problem? That may be. Let's keep reading. C, is a problem that arises or becomes worse as a result of climate change. That's a pretty good definition of a climate change problem. A climate change problem is a problem that arises or becomes worse as a result of climate change. That one looks good. But let's go to the last one. Is caused by government planning failures and resource mismanagement. Well, that's not a climate change problem, I don't think. Climate change problems are caused by climate change. So I think the best answer is C here. So let's check. And, whoops. There. C is the one that's left. So C is the correct answer. All right, so that does it for part 1 of Module 1. Okay, so let's move on into part 2 of Module 1. And in part 2, we're looking at developing the climate evidence base for your concept note. This is among the most challenging parts of putting together a concept note for the GCF, and this is one of the reasons that many concept notes get rejected or or sent back for revision multiple times because they do not have a clear evidence base. So our second task in the module is to develop this evidence base for your concept note. And it's a critical part of the concept note because it demonstrates to GCF that your project addresses climate change challenges rather than development challenges. So there's a key distinction between climate change projects and development projects, and we'll discuss that distinction. But the climate change evidence base it's important because climate funds such as the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund have been designed specifically to address problems that are caused by climate change, not problems that are driven primarily by human factors. So human factors include things like mismanagement of resources or poor governance or other basic economic and social development issues. So the reason that the climate funds, like the Green Climate Fund, stay away from development issues is because they've been established under the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and this obliges developed countries to provide new and additional financing to developing countries to address the impacts of climate change. So the new and additional clause was included in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to help ensure that developed countries do not divert existing development aid and budgets to climate change. In practical terms, this is meant to ensure that funding for climate change projects does not come at the expense of funds that are already available to assist developing countries in meeting their general development goals, right? So there's a distinction in causality here, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. But as you can see, the part of your concept note template that we are addressing is the first part in B1. It says describe as relevant the climate vulnerabilities and impacts, the greenhouse gas emissions profile, and the mitigation and adaptation needs that the prospective intervention is envisaged to address. And this simply means describe the climate change problem that your project is going to address. So next, let's look at climate change projects versus development projects. And there is a difference. So the first question to answer, we've got three questions here, really. The first question is, what's the difference? Well, simply put, climate change projects address problems that are being driven primarily by physical processes of climate change. So, for example, these problems are rooted in, or they come from increasing temperatures, or changing patterns of precipitation, or sea level rise, or changes in climate and meteorological extremes. Development projects, on the other hand, seek to address fundamental socioeconomic, governance, natural resource management, and conservation issues. So that's the difference. A climate change problem focuses on climate, changing environmental conditions. A development project focuses on development issues. So the key difference between the two is the causality of the problem. The GCF will not fund development projects. So why is it important? That's question number 2. Well, it's important because the GCF will not fund development projects. But more specifically, the Green Climate Fund incorporates the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's provision that developed countries must provide new and additional financing to developed countries to address global warming and climate change. So, like we said earlier, a major reason for this was to prevent developed countries from diverting existing assistance, existing ODA, overseas development assistance, to address climate change. In other words, new and additional means that developed countries should provide more financing. It's not simply repurpose existing aid funds. So they want to contribute new money, not the same money that has already been contributed. So because of this, the GCF and other climate financiers are very selective about the projects they fund. All GCF projects have to address problems that are driven by climate change rather than some development issue. GCF projects certainly have development co-benefits, and GCF funds can be part of a larger package of financing in which GCF support is used to cover the climate change related parts of a larger package. And this would include traditional sources of development finance. So you can have a blended project that includes money from the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or some bilateral development partner, or from UNDP or someplace else, and that money is combined with the GCF money. And the GCF money addresses the climate part of the problem, whereas the ADB money, the Asian Development Bank or African Development Bank or the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank money, that addresses the development part of the problem. So that would be a blended finance project. Now, lastly, our last question is, does it really make a difference? And it does indeed make a difference for at least two reasons. Now, in general, if the distinction was not in place, and if the GCF did not carefully screen projects for the evidence base, then it's likely that the fund would not be able to fulfill its mission of addressing development countries' climate vulnerabilities. And so eventually support for the fund would diminish. Now, from the perspective of individual projects, it matters as well, too. For example, if a project tries to solve a problem by addressing climate vulnerabilities, but the problem is really driven by resource mismanagement or poor governance or some other factor, then it's unlikely that the project will be effective. The project won't work because it's trying to solve the wrong problem. It's trying to solve a climate problem when the real issue, the real driving root is a development issue like poor governance. So, for example, in many situations, increased flooding may be caused primarily by deforestation upstream. And we're familiar with these situations, most of us. So we cut down all the trees upstream, and this leads to more runoff when it rains, rather than more intense rainfall events. So if we develop a climate change adaptation project to improve floodwater management downstream, the project is not likely to have a lasting impact or results because we haven't addressed a real problem of deforestation, which is causing the flooding. That's going to continue to get worse, and it will make flooding worse. So our money won't go as far as it should go in that situation. So let's look at the definition for the evidence base. What is a climate change evidence base? Well, the climate change evidence base, and we've got a definition here. The climate change evidence base provides a scientific underpinning for climate action, decision making, and the theory of change for all kinds of activities funded by the GCF. It demonstrates a connection between the physical processes of climate change, their impact on society, and the benefits that the proposed project will deliver. The evidence base is grounded in the best available data and science concerning the most relevant climate factors. That's a GCF definition for the climate change evidence base. So our tip then is to start with your climate change framework, because your climate change framework, the NAP, the NDCs, they are often already built on a good evidence base. They have data and information. That research work has already been done. So if your country has a NAP or an NDC or something like that, you can refer to some of the climate science that's in that document. So another key tip is don't start with a project that you want to do and then work backwards to develop an evidence base. So let's say you have a project that you've wanted to do for 5 years. You just needed to find funding for it. And all of a sudden, here's the GCF. This would be a great source of funding for your project. In this case, you may try to retrofit a climate change rationale onto this existing project that you have. And generally, that's a bad idea. That's not something that you want to do. That approach almost always fails because it's easy to tell that these sorts of proposals are not really focused on climate change. They're focused on a development issue, but they've been given a climate rationale that doesn't really explain the problem. So our next slide here, let's look at climate change to project here. And as you can see, the way that we move to the project is the evidence base. It draws a clear line between the physical processes of climate change and the impact that our project seeks to address, right? And we'll talk more about this in the tutorial video, which we also have, and the guide and exercise that we have. But moving from climate change to project, we want to first identify the climate change physical processes that are affecting the country, and then we've got our hazards and our pathways, and these lead to impacts. These are ways that people, places, and things can be harmed by climate change. So we're gonna in our project preparation activity, we're going to conduct some background research on each of these bubbles here. We're going to find out what the climate change physical processes are. Maybe increasing temperatures or changing precipitation patterns, changing rainfall patterns, those sorts of things. And we're going to see how those affect the hazards, like droughts and floods and landslides and things like that. And then how those hazards can harm people. So how does flooding harm people? Well, it destroys crops. It destroys structures. And then we're going to look at the impacts on people, places, and things. And we'll step through each of these, but these are the key elements that we want to tease out in developing our concept note. And to do that, we use a tool, and that tool is called the impact chain analysis. The impact chain analysis, again, as I mentioned earlier, we have a whole video on the impact chain analysis to show you how to do it, and we have a guide and exercise. So the module includes a tool and an exercise to help you conceptualize the connection between climate change and the impacts in your country. So you can use this tool with your project team, with your concept note development team, to map out the evidence-based logic that demonstrates that your project responds to a climate change problem and not a development problem. So the impact chain really helps you to tell the story of how the physical process of climate change are having an impact on your country. Like we said, it allows you to draw a line from the physical processes to the impacts, and then eventually to your project intervention. And that helps to ensure that your project is a climate change project. Let's look at an example here. This illustration shows an example from an actual impact chain analysis. And we've got a connection between physical processes and impacts on rural livelihoods. So the categories here, we've got our drivers. These are the physical processes of climate change. And these are here. And in this example, you can see that the drivers are unpredictable weather patterns, increased precipitation, extreme weather events, and increased temperatures. Our hazards in our second column here, right? These are made worse, exacerbated by the physical processes. So the physical processes make the hazards worse, or they introduce new hazards. So the hazards are events that may cause loss of life or injury, or damage or loss to property, infrastructure, livelihood, service provision, etc. And then we've got our pathways. Here in our example we call these channels, but the language that we use is exposure pathways. And these pathways describe how hazards can harm people, places, and things. So for example, if we have increased temperatures down here, increased temperature can lead to droughts. And how does a drought hurt people? Well, a drought hurts people by reducing yields of crops, agricultural productivity, or failed crops, right? So we have a chain. That's why we call this an impact chain. We have a chain of causality that we're following. Increased precipitation, that's a physical process. That comes from climate change and global warming. We have more rainfall. Increased precipitation, well, that can lead to erosion and landslides, right? Because there's more rainfall, there's more erosion and landslides. So erosion and landslides is our hazard. And how does landslide hurt people, places, and things? Well, in a number of ways. It can lead to physical and economic displacement for sure, because people may lose their houses and they have to move someplace else. Or it can lead to destruction of agriculture infrastructure, physical damage to it. It can lead to failed crops and reduced yields, all of these things, right? So these are the channels, these are the ways that people are hurt by erosion and landslides. We could probably think of other reasons as well, but you get the idea. And lastly, our last element is the impacts. And the impacts describe the effects of the harm on people, places, and things. This is the bigger picture issue. Why is the damage important, right? So, for example, if we have failed crops and reduced yields, well, why is that bad? It's obvious why it's bad, but it helps us to lay out explicitly why it's bad. And in this case, we'll have increasing food insecurity, or farmers may default on loans, and so forth. So that's how our impact chain analysis works. It can help also, when you use this tool to inform your concept note, it can help to raise awareness among stakeholders about these linkages between climate change processes and impacts. Because what we find in many cases that stakeholders, and this goes for local people in villages, rural residents, but it also goes for government officials too in many cases. They're not necessarily aware of the specific ways that climate change can harm people, places, and things. All right, so next, let's take a little quiz here, just to make sure that we understand the definitions. Now, on the left-hand side, over here, you can see our definitions, and on the right-hand side, we've got our terms. So we've got climate change impact, climate change driver, and evidence-based. Those are our choices. And we're going to draw an arrow from the definition to the proper word. So our definitions are linking the physical processes of climate change to the effects of human systems and activities. We've got how physical processes ultimately affect people, places, and things. And then we've got physical processes associated with climate change. Those are our three definitions. So linking the physical processes of climate change to effects on human systems and activities. What is that? What is that? Is that climate change impact? No, not really. Is it the climate change driver? That's not exactly what that means. Is it the evidence base? The evidence base definitely is the linkage between the physical process of climate change to the effects on human systems and activities. So that's what our definition of evidence base is. Next, we've got how physical processes ultimately affect people, places, and things, and that's our climate change impact. Climate change impact. The climate change impact is how physical processes ultimately affect people, places, and things. And then lastly, very obviously, our climate change driver, well, that's a physical process associated with climate change. So, good, we've got 100%. So now let's move on back to our example of Keithtopia. And if you recall from the first part of the lesson, from the first part of the module, Keithtopia is a small island developing state, a least developed country. And we have decided that we're going to do an agriculture-themed project for climate change adaptation, because that's one of the priorities in the NAP and the National Development Plan, and also the agriculture sector plan. Agriculture is very important. There's lots of vulnerabilities. So in developing our evidence base here, we're going to identify, we've got 5 steps. 5 steps. And these are 5 steps that you can follow in developing your own narrative, your own written description for your concept note. So number 1, we'll identify the climate drivers from our policy review. So we'll read through the NAP and the NDC and these things, and it will tell us about the climate drivers. And then we're going to look for sector-specific hazard information on that. In this case, on the agriculture sector, because we're doing an agriculture sector project. And then step 3, we'll identify the pathway by which the hazard can harm people. And step 4, we'll identify the impact that the hazard has on people. So we're using all of the elements from our impact chain analysis to inform our description in the concept note template. So if you can, remember to integrate subnational information specific to your project's target area. In most cases with a SAP, we're not going to focus on the whole country, but we'll focus on a region. So if you can include regional information or information that is specific to the region that you are targeting, that's good. So let's step through our narrative for Keytopia and what we did. So step 1, identify climate drivers from the policy review. So to do this, to develop our climate change evidence base, we start with the big picture processes of climate change that our country is experiencing or will experience in the future. So in most cases, we can find this information in the climate change strategy and the policy documents that we reviewed for the first step in the concept note development, back when we were looking at the policy linkages. Yeah. So in the case of Keytopia, the physical processes are things like increasing temperatures, sea level rise, and changing seasonal patterns. Those are the issues in Keytopia. So it helps to describe some actual observations too, from the instrumental record as well as future projections. So step 2, then, we identify the sector-specific hazards. So these are the ways that the physical processes are going to cause harm to the agriculture sector. So we describe how the physical processes create the conditions that can lead to harm for people, places, and things. And we're focusing on the sector that our project will address. So in our example, since we're focusing on the agriculture sector, right, that will look at impacts for the agriculture sector. We're going to look for analyses and information on how these physical processes that we described in step 1, like increasing temperature and changing seasons, may affect crop growth. Now in our example of Keytopia, we were able to identify a vulnerability assessment that was conducted by the Ministry of Agriculture, Forests, and Fisheries, as well as some other information describing hazards like drought. So we'll use that, right? That's step 2. Now step 3, identify the pathway by which hazards can harm people. These are our exposure pathways here, right? Remember step 3? So in step 3, we describe how the hazards, the enhanced hazards, have affected people, places, and things, or how they will affect human systems in the future. So, for example, drought leads to declining crop yields. Increasing extreme rainfall events can cause more erosion, which can reduce the productivity of soil, and it can also flood farms, killing the crops. So here again, it's useful to describe observed damages, but it is also very important to include research and projections that indicate that the problem will be worse in the future as the climate continues to change. This helps to make the case that we really need to do something about it with a project, that it's an urgent need. So then with step 4, we describe the impact that the hazard has on people. So this is how people, places, and things are harmed. For example, declining crop yields caused by drought, well, that can lead to reduced farm incomes, it can lead to decreased food security, and ultimately to more malnutrition and other health issues, and an overall decline in rural livelihoods. So you see that we're piecing this together. We're piecing together a story based on the impact chain analysis. The impact chain analysis tells us the story, and we just have to weave it together. So on the next slide, we're going to look at how we filled this out in our actual template. Now remember that down here, this is the information that we filled out earlier about the policy linkages. Now we're focusing on these 2 paragraphs here, and remember, we don't have very much space here. Now you can go over this word limit if you need to, right? And eventually the GCF will come back and ask you for more clarifications, And in subsequent rounds of submitting your proposal, you will have to provide a lot more information. But just to start with, on our first submission, we want to have a good brief explanation here. So as you can see, it says Keithtopia is highly vulnerable to climate change, including increases in temperature, sea level rise, and changes in seasons, making rainfall less reliable. Average temperature in the capital of Keithopolis have increased 1 degree Celsius from 1950 to 2018. Globally, the 5 hottest years on record were also the 5 hottest years in Keithtopia. From 1986 to 2016, sea level has risen 1.5 millimeters per year. Other changes include a significant increase in drought and cyclone activity and intensity. The 2018 World Risk Report ranked Keithtopia as the 5th most vulnerable country to extreme weather events in the world. So here we're clearly making a case that climate change is an issue and that our country is vulnerable. And you can see that we have our references here. This is Government of Keithtopia, some report that came out in 2019, Government of Keithtopia, the World Resources Program, or something like that. Yeah. So let's go on to the second paragraph, and these are the overall climate change physical processes here, right? The physical processes, and we're starting to talk about hazards like drought. Now we're going to get into our exposure pathways and our impact next, right? We're just following the pattern from the impact chain analysis. So these changes have affected the agriculture sector. The rise in temperature is increasing the water demand for crops and causing an increase in the incidences of, and that should say drought. Sorry, there's an error here. Overall harvests have decreased by 15% over the last 10 years, and during the 2015-2016 El Nino-driven drought, farmers reported losses of up to 75% of their normal yields. In 2018, Tropical Cyclone Karen produced heavy rains that resulted in highland flooding and storm surge, which caused coastal flooding due to elevated sea levels. According to the Ministry of Agriculture, Karen caused losses in the agriculture sector exceeding $20 million US, resulting in widespread food insecurity and migration of rural farmers to the capital. So you can see our impact chain very clearly laid out there. We're setting up. We're setting up for the GCF that our problem is a climate change problem and not a development problem. So it's a climate change project that we're going to do. And again, we followed the impact chain analysis. We went from the physical processes of climate change to the hazards, to the exposure pathways, to the impacts on people. And really, that's what the evidence base does. So on our next slide, let's look at best practices for developing your evidence base. Number one, and this is a rule that I've developed over the years of developing, working on climate change issues. One rule of thumb, one way to tell that you have a climate change problem and not a development problem. Well, if you think about your problem, and if you take climate change out of the picture and you still have a big problem, well, then it's not a climate change problem. So in other words, if the problem that you're addressing or that you want to address with your project, think about a world where there's no climate change. And in that world, an imaginary world, but in that world, if you take climate change away and you still have a problem, well, then the problem it's not a climate change problem, it's a development problem. So you should probably consider a different problem for your project, right? So don't be afraid to switch problems, right? Don't be focused on one problem. Then the second tip here is look for emerging issues. These are things that climate change will turn into larger problems if they're not addressed early, right? So this helps to justify a project, especially if we have an evidence base, if we have projections for the future, and we can say, well, if we don't make an investment now in addressing this issue, in the future the losses are going to be higher. And the economic losses, the loss of livelihoods and lives, is going to be very high if we don't take action now. This is an urgent need. So those are the types of problems we're looking for. Also, use documented, observed processes and impacts and rigorously projected future projections. So when developing your evidence base, make sure that that everything that you describe in your evidence base that you can back it up, that you have data and information that you can cite to demonstrate that yes, indeed these things are happening. Don't make anything up. We need it to be rigorous because the GCF will check on these things. And they will ask you for the documentation. They'll ask you for the studies, to reference the studies and things like that. Next, look for instances where climate change is making a previously manageable issue unmanageable. So this is a good way to identify a climate change problem. If you have a small problem that is locally manageable, but climate change is happening, and all of a sudden that small problem becomes a very big problem that is no longer locally manageable. That's a good issue. That's a good example of a climate change problem. Or for example, if traditionally in your country or historically you've had a drought every decade or so, and that's a natural process. A drought is. But your country has coping mechanisms. It can deal with a drought that happens every decade. Communities are resilient to that, and they have coping mechanisms and adaptive capacity just for a drought that happens on average every decade. But what if climate change makes that drought happen not every decade, but every 7 years or twice a decade? Well, then the adaptive capacity, the coping capacity of the people is exceeded in many cases, right? So it becomes a bigger problem that is no longer locally manageable. So that's a good potential climate change issue to address. And then lastly, if you address a development project in climate change close, the GCF will always know. They're very good at sniffing those things out. So in other words, if you take a project that was originally a development project and you're shopping it around, you're looking for funding for it, and then you take that development project and you attach a climate change rationale, a climate change evidence base to it, it's very easy for the GCF to see that, and they will see it, and they'll send you back to the drawing board. So those are our best practices. Now, next slide, the end. And here's a final picture from beautiful Hawaii, where your instructor's home base. And so that's the end of Module 1. I hope this walkthrough and read-through has been useful to you. Again, if you can, use the self-guided presentation, because most of the text, you can read that for yourself. But further, next steps for you in this module, download the worksheets and do the exercises. There's exercises on developing your policy linkages and also on developing your climate change evidence base. So we have good step-by-step guidance for that. And view the impact chain analysis demonstration video. So we've got another video that we made that takes you step-by-step through the process of developing an impact chain analysis, and also make sure to look at the resources for the video or for the module. So that's great. That's it. That's all for this module. Thank you very much for your attentiveness, and we'll see you in Module 2. Bye bye.